He knelt in the middle of the river, and there was no river. Only a long white road of dry stones, animal tracks pressed into the dust, and a family behind him that would soon be too weak to search anywhere else. This channel had carried water his entire life. Now, he dug at its deepest point. Dry. He dug past his wrist. Still dry. Above him, the sky was the same hard blue it had been for 3 months. Not one cloud, not one promise of rain. Then, far beneath the pale sand, his fingers touched something cooler. Not water. Not yet. But perhaps enough to tell him where the river had gone. He had to find it before the old woman, the nursing mother, and the children lost the strength to move. Because the drought did not need to kill them where they stood. It only had to make the water farther away than his family could walk. We fear the storm and the freeze because they arrive. A drought does the opposite. It is the disaster of nothing happening, over and over, until the nothing becomes the most dangerous thing in the world. There was no single bad day. That was the cruelty of it. The rains that should have come at their season simply did not. And at first that was almost nothing. A dry spell. The kind any year might bring. The water holes drew down a little. The grass yellowed early. People said the rain was late, the way they always said it, and waited. But the rain that is late can still be the rain that never comes. And there is no way, in the waiting, to tell the two apart until the difference has already begun to kill you. By the second mist season, the shallow water was gone. The small pools that dotted the land in a normal year had dried to cracked clay, and the animals had drawn back toward the few places that still held. By the third, the land itself had changed character. The green retreated to the low places, and then out of the low places too. Dust moved where grass had been, and the great engine that fed everything these people ate, the herds, the grazers, the migrating animals that were meat and fat and hide and life, began, quietly, to leave. Because animals do not wait and hope. Animals go to water. And when the herds move, the whole world these people lived on moves with them, out past the horizon, toward rumors of rain falling somewhere else. A family left standing in a drying land while the herds walked away was a family being slowly cut off from everything that kept it alive. Not in a day, over a season, which was, in its own way, worse, because it gave you time to watch it happen. Hunger is slow. A person can go a long while on very little food, growing weak, growing thin, but living. Thirst is not slow, and that changed every calculation these people made. A body without water fails in days, not weeks. And it fails fast at the end. The strength going, the thinking clouding, the body unable to cool itself in exactly the heat that is driving the crisis. In a drought, the sun does double work. It withholds the water, and then, with the same light, it bakes the water out of every living thing that remains. The hotter the day, the more a body needs to drink. At the precise moment there is least to drink. This is why water, not food, ruled every decision. You could be surrounded by animals and still die, if you could not drink. You could sit on a store of dried meat and watch it become useless, because meat without water to process it only deepens the thirst. Everything bent around the water. Where you camped, how far you dared to range, whether you moved or stayed, who could make the journey and who could not. All of it was set by the distance to the nearest water a body could still reach, before that same body gave out on the way. And the distances were growing. Every dry week pushed the water further out, which meant longer walks to reach it, which meant more water spent getting there, which meant you needed to be stronger to make a journey that was making everyone weaker. The drought did not just take the water away. It made the water harder to reach in exact proportion to how badly you needed it. That was the trap closing around the valley. And the man in the dead river was one of the few who knew the way out of it was not up, toward the empty sky, but down, into the ground the river had left behind. Because a dead river is not as dead as it looks, and he knew it the way he knew his own hands. Water sinks. When a river stops running on the surface, it does not always stop entirely. It retreats downward, into the sand and gravel of its own bed, and travels on unseen beneath the stones. The surface is bone dry, but dig in the right place, at the outside of a bend where the water ran deepest, or at the low points where the bed dips, and the sand grows damp, then wet, then gives up water that seeps slowly into the hole you have made. He had learned this from watching, and from being shown, and from the memory of hard years. There were signs to read, and reading them was the whole difference between a wasted hole and a drink. The green of certain deep-rooted plants that will not grow where there is no water below. the place animals returned to and pawed at, because they smelled what a person could not. The particular darker tone of sand that held moisture under a dry crust. A person who knew these signs could walk a dead riverbed and see, written across it, a hidden map of where the water still lived beneath the stone. So he dug. He chose the outside of the bend, below the old high bank, and he dug down through dry sand with a shaped stick in his hands, and the sand grew cooler as he went, and then darker, and then, far down, further than in any ordinary year, it grew damp against his fingers. Damp, not wet, not yet water. He had found where the river had gone, but it had gone deeper than he had ever known it to go, and that told him something about this drought he did not want to know, that it was not like the others, and that damp sand at the bottom of a long hole was not going to be enough to keep his people alive. Kneel with him at the edge of that hole, because the problem was never only the water. The problem was who had to reach it. He could make the walk. A grown hunter in his strength could go a long way on a little, could range out to distant water and back, could follow the herds across dry country for days. But a family is not made of hunters. It is made of the old woman whose knees had begun to fail her, and the child who could not yet walk a morning without being carried, and the nursing mother whose own body was being drained twice over, by the heat, and by the infant pulling the last of the water out of her. That was the true shape of the danger, not his thirst, theirs. Every choice he weighed had their bodies inside it. If the water was 3 days' walk away, then 3 days was not a number. It was whether his mother could survive the journey, whether the baby would last the crossing, whether the group could carry enough water to reach the next water without emptying what they carried before they arrived. A strong man alone survives a drought easily. He walks to the water and drinks. A family survives or fails together, at the pace of its weakest member, and the weakest member sets the whole radius of what is possible. And they were watching him. That was its own weight. The children read his face for whether to be afraid. His mother, who had seen more dry years than he had, watched his hands and said nothing, saving her own words for when they would matter. He filled a gourd, slowly, with the water that seeped into the hole, an hour's patient work for what a running stream would give in a breath. And he made the decision he had been avoiding for a week. They could not stay. The dug water was too little and too slow to keep them all. They would have to leave the dead river and go where the water and the herds had gone, out past the horizon, into country he did not know as well, on the strength of a plan he was not sure would hold. And here his mother finally spoke, and what she said changed everything. She had been a girl in a drought worse than this one. She remembered it, not as a story, but in her body, the way you remember the year that nearly took you. And she remembered where her own people had gone when the near rivers died. Not toward the nearest water, which everyone knew and everyone crowded and everyone drank dry. Toward the high rock country to the east, she said, where there was water that had nothing to do with the rain at all. That was the thing she made him understand, there at the dead river, before she would say another word about the journey. The water holes and the rivers were rain. They rose when the sky gave, and they died when the sky closed. And this sky had closed. But in the high rock, deep under the stone, ran water that came from somewhere older than any season. Water that had fallen as rain in years no living person could remember, and sunk, and traveled slow through the rock, and surfaced now in a place the drought could not reach, because the drought had never fed it in the first place. That was why it ran when everything else failed. Not luck. Not that one lucky spring had happened to survive. It ran because it was never the sky's to take away. He had never seen it. He had never needed to. But she carried it. The direction, the landmarks, the shape of the journey, and, deeper than any of that, the reason, held in a mind that had kept it safe for 50 years against exactly this. The map out of the drought was not in the land. It was in the oldest person at the fire. So they went east, toward water, one old woman remembered, across country that was trying to stop them. The first days were the hard teaching of what a drought crossing costs. They walked in the cool of the early morning and the last of the evening and lay in what shade they could find through the killing middle of the day, because to walk in that sun was to pour out water they could not replace. They carried every drop they had in gourds and sealed skins, and they drank by strict measure, the children first, then the old woman, then the mother, then him, and he took less than last. The dried meat they carried they barely touched, because eating it drove the thirst harder, and thirst was the enemy, not hunger. They followed the herd's own knowledge where they could. The tracks of animals that had passed before them ran in loose lines across the dust, and animals go to water, So the converging of the tracks, the way scattered trails drew together toward a single direction, was a message written by creatures who could smell what he could not. On the third day, the child stopped sweating and went quiet and grew hot to the touch, and he knew the sign and it froze him. He gave the child water out of turn, out of his own share and the next day's, and carried the small body himself through the cool hours, and watched and waited. The child came back, slowly. By evening there was complaint again, and complaint from a child is the sound of a child who will live. But the water they carried was more than half gone, and the high rock his mother spoke of was still not in sight, and the country ahead had begun to rise into dry stone, where he could see, from a long way off, no green at all. They came up into the rock country in the evening, and it was the emptiest place any of them had ever walked into, and the stillness of it was almost a kind of peace. There was nothing here, no grass, no game, no birdsong, only bare stone going gold and then gray as the light left it, and the enormous silence of a land with the life pressed out of it. They made a dry camp in the lee of a ridge and did not light much of a fire, because there was little to burn, and they sat close in the cooling dark with the water nearly gone and said very little. This was the low point, and it did not feel like terror. It felt like waiting. The old woman sat looking east into country she had not seen since she was a girl, and he understood that she was not remembering a map so much as feeling for one, turning the shapes of the ridges against something held deep inside her, checking the land in front of her eyes against the land inside her memory. He did not rush her. Everything now rested on whether she could still find, in an old woman's failing sight and a 50-year-old memory, the one fold of rock where the deep water came up. The baby slept. The child slept. He sat awake and did the thing you do at the bottom of a hard journey, which is not to plan, because the planning is done, but simply to endure the hours until you can move again. And in the deep of that night, the old woman touched his arm and pointed at a shape against the stars, a particular notch in the high ridgeline to the east. She had found her landmark. The water, she said, lay under the far side of that notch, in the shaded fold where the sun reached only at noon. One more day. And here is the thing that the whole journey had quietly been about, though he had not seen it until that moment in the dark. He was the strong one. He could dig the dry bed, read the sand, carry the child, walk the distance, make the hunt. But not one of those skills would have been worth anything without the knowledge of where to point them. And that knowledge was not his. It lived in a body too old to dig and too weak to walk fast. In the one person the hard reckoning of a drought might have called a burden. The old woman could not have crossed this country alone. He could not have found the far side of it alone. Neither of them apart would have lived. This is the answer the drought was teaching, written across 3 generations walking east. A single person, however strong, holds only one lifetime of knowledge, and a drought is a thing that comes rarely enough that no single lifetime sees enough of them to learn. The deep water in the high rock mattered maybe twice in 100 years. On the years the sky failed and the rain-fed water died, no one who used it in a crisis was likely to be alive for the next one, which meant the only way the knowledge survived was to be carried, passed down, held in the old against the day the young would need it, kept alive in memory across the long, ordinary decades when it seemed like useless talk about a place no one ever had to go. The old woman was not a burden the drought forced them to carry. She was the reason they were still alive. But the carrying of that knowledge had its own hard edge, and he felt it in her as they walked the final day. She was spending herself to bring them there. The journey was taking more out of her than out of any of them. Every dry mile pulled harder on the oldest body, and she gave her share of the water back more than once, quietly, to the child, in a way she did not want him to see. She had one purpose left that mattered more to her than her own thirst, and it was to reach that notch in the ridge and put her people beside the water before her strength ran out. She was, he slowly understood, prepared to arrive with nothing left. And there was a harder truth underneath it, the kind the drought forced into the open. In the very worst years, when the water and the food fell to almost nothing, the choices could turn cruel. And the old knew it better than anyone, because the old had watched it happen in the droughts of their own youth. They knew that a group pushed to the edge sometimes could not carry everyone. They knew which mouths got water first when there was not enough, and it was not theirs. The willingness of the old to go last, to give the water back, to spend themselves getting the young to safety, that was not only love. It was the clear-eyed understanding of people who knew exactly what a drought could ask, and had decided, in advance, what they would give. He watched his mother walk toward the notch in the ridge, on legs that were failing her, carrying 50 years of memory toward water she had not seen since she was a girl. And he understood that everything now depended on whether her memory of the high rock was as true as the reason she had given for trusting it. They came over the ridge in the middle of the last day, in the full weight of the sun, with the water gone. The gourds carrying nothing now but a few warm mouthfuls he had hidden back for the child. And they looked down the far side into a narrow rock valley, and he did not understand at first what he was seeing. Green. A thin line of it, low in the fold of the rock. Not the gray-green of desert scrub that survives on almost nothing. The deep, wrong, impossible green of plants that have never once gone thirsty. He went down the slope faster than was wise, half falling over the loose stone, the breath tearing in his dry throat, and the old woman came behind him as fast as her failing legs would carry her. At the bottom, under an overhang of rock where the sun reached only at the height of noon, the stone was dark and wet, and water stood in a shallow basin worn into the rock over uncounted years, and more of it seeped from a crack in the cliff face, slow and steady and cool, the way it had seeped there for longer than any person walking that country had been alive. The spring ran. After 50 years, held in one woman's memory across a whole lifetime of ordinary rains, the spring still ran. He put his hand in it, just to feel that it was real. Then he was carrying the child to it, and the mother was there with the baby, and they were drinking, carefully at first, because a body that thirsty must be given water slowly, or it will reject the very thing it needs, and then more, the cool of it going down into them, like life coming back into a dead thing. The children came alive again in front of his eyes. The dullness went out of them. The complaint came back. A small argument broke out over the gourd, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in a season, because a child with the strength to argue is a child who is going to live. The old woman knelt at the edge of the basin and did not drink first. She watched the children drink, and then the mother, and only when the others had taken their fill did she cup her own hands and lower her face to the water she had carried in her mind for half a century. Water she had drunk once as a girl, in another dry year, beside people who were all gone now, and had kept the memory of ever since against exactly this day. He looked away from her then. Some things a person should be allowed to do without being watched. They were not saved forever. He knew that, even in the flood of relief. The spring was small. It would water a family, not a nation, and it would not fill the rivers or call the herds back or end the dry years. The drought was not broken, and the rains, when they finally came, would come in their own time, and not one day before, but they would live to see them. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. In a drought, survival is never a victory that ends the war. It is only the reaching of the next water, and then the next, and the willingness to keep reaching until the sky finally changes. They had reached this one. Tomorrow they would think about the one after. Tonight, they drank. So, how did ancient humans survive when the rain never came? Not by praying the sky open, and not by enduring in one place while the world dried to dust around them. They survived by knowing the land more deeply than the drought could take it from them. By understanding that a dead river still holds water in its bones, if you can read where to dig. By tracing the herds and the deep-rooted plants and the converging animal tracks as a map to where the water had quietly retreated. By rationing what they carried with an iron discipline, the weakest drinking first and the strongest going short, so that no one strong survived while the weak were spent. And above all, by moving, following the water and the herds out across country they would rather never have entered, toward places held not in the land itself, but in the memory of the people who had lived through the last time the world went dry. That is the honest answer, and it is not the heroic one we might want. It is patience and knowledge, and the plain willingness to walk when staying meant dying. The drought did not test their strength. A drought does not care how strong you are. The strongest man alive dies in 4 days without water, exactly like the weakest. It tested what they knew, and how faithfully they had kept it, and whether the young would still listen to the old, when the old pointed at an empty, shimmering horizon and said, "There, the water is there, I have seen it with my own eyes, follow me." The bands that survived the dry years were not the fiercest or the fastest. They were the ones who had held their knowledge carefully across the good years, so that it stood ready, undiminished, in the bad one. The rains came back, in their own season, as in the end they always did. The dry riverbeds filled and ran again. The herds returned across the plains in their great slow rivers of movement, and the low places went green, and the water holes brimmed as though they had never been cracked clay. And the dry years folded down into the long memory of the band and became, in time, a story. The story of the drought they walked out of, and the spring in the high rock that ran when nothing else did, and the old woman who carried the way to it inside her for 50 years. And that story was the whole point of everything, because the child who drank from that spring would carry it now. The direction, the notch in the ridge against the stars, the impossible green in the fold of the rock, and would hold it through his own long life of ordinary rains, useless knowledge in every year but one, ready against the season his own grandchildren might stand in a dead river and need it. That is what actually survived the drought. Not only the people, the knowing, passed hand to hand and mouth to ear, carried forward, kept alive in the old for the sake of the young, across more dry years than any single person would ever live to see. We still do this, though we have long forgotten why it runs so deep in us. The pull to keep the old stories, to sit the young down and make them listen, to hold on to the memory of the last hard time against the next one that has not yet come. It does not feel like survival anymore. It feels like sentiment, like tradition, like the ramblings of the old that the young half hear and hurry past. But it did not begin as any of those things. It began as the most practical act there is. It began at a spring in the high rock, with a woman pointing at a burning horizon, carrying water in her memory, that saved the people who had almost not believed her. If the quiet knowledge that carried our ancestors through the dry years is the kind of story that stays with you, keep close to this channel. There's another hard season waiting, and I'd like you here when the rain finally comes.